and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. In this episode, we are going to be looking at Kawasaki's GPZ1100 that was produced from 1995 through 1997. We're going to be looking at the history of the bike, some specs, and my riding impressions of that bike. This is the fourth episode in my Blast from the Past series, and in this series we are opening the old photo album, and I just thought it would be fun to share my riding impressions of those bikes with you. Kawasaki GPZ history. In 1995, Kawasaki resurrected the GPZ name that they had used to designate their sport bikes back in the early 80s. They created what was essentially kind of a sport tourer. The motor in the GPZ1100 was based on the motor found in Kawasaki's mighty ZX11, and it was retuned. They used straight intakes on it instead of the downdraft carburetors on the ZX11. They also eliminated the ram air system from the ZX11 and just went with a standard induction system. It had milder cam profiles, and it also had smaller carburetors. The changes were really designed to kind of enhance drivability, especially at the low and mid-range RPM range. It was also designed to really enhance torque. Man, the strong point of this motor, it made 74 foot-pounds of torque. When you got on the throttle, especially at low engine RPM, this thing just took off. Very, very torquey motor, very smooth motor. But those changes also limited the horsepower on the top end, and whereas the ZX11 made around 135 horsepower at the rear wheel, the GPZ made somewhere between 110 and 115 horsepower at the rear wheel. Wet weight on the GPZ was right around 590 pounds. The motor was a 1052cc inline four-cylinder. It was a 16-valve motor. It had liquid cooling. It had a slick-shifting 6-speed transmission. And the top speed on the GPZ was right around 155 miles an hour. And if you contrast that again with the ZX11 was about 20 miles an hour faster. And that's where the additional power and the ram air kicks in, is at those higher speeds. The fuel range on the GPZ was very good. It had a 5.8 gallon gas tank. The ergonomics on the GPZ, it was set up with more legroom than the ZX11. It had a higher seat height. It also had bars that were a little bit taller than the ZX11s. And overall, the bike felt tall. I'm 6'4", and it was a tall bike. This particular GPZ, when I bought it from the original owner. It had the color-matched hard bags on the side, and unfortunately, they weren't like today's hard bags. They were ones that you had to, take time to mount or dismount, and they also really didn't carry that much. They weren't super usable as luggage. I'm not sure why they didn't use the Kawasaki Concours luggage and make that available on the bike, because the Concours luggage of the time was very good. The GPZ also sported dual disc brakes in the front and a large disc brake in the rear. At the time that I owned my GPZ, the front brakes on that bike were among the best that I had experienced. You could hit the brakes and have complete control and actually feel the weight of your cheeks pushing forward in your helmet. It would just stop so quickly. And I was very, very impressed by the brakes. One of the strong points of the GPZ1100 was that it was very, very quick off the line. If you were drag racing this motorcycle, really I found the best launch technique was to rev the bike to 4,000 RPM and simultaneously dump the clutch and give it full throttle. And it would just hammer away from a stop. Usually when I went up against other people, it would jump 2 or 3 bike lengths right off the line. If I was racing somebody with a faster bike, they would eventually reel me in, but they had such a hard time making up that initial jump. The GPZ actually held the record for the quickest 60-foot time of any production motorcycle for quite some time. It was a very hard launching bike and easy to launch. It didn't threaten to wheelie back over, it just went. My backstory with this GPZ: my first sport bike was a Kawasaki ZX10, which I covered in the previous video. And I loved my ZX10, and I really missed it when I sold it. And so when I saw the GPZ come out, I thought, man, that looks like it would be a good replacement for the ZX10. Had similar horsepower at the rear wheel, and it looked like it would be more comfortable. It would be something that my wife and I could ride, and so I actually drove up to Long Island, New York, and picked that bike up. And while it was marginally more comfortable than the ZX10, to me it was refined, it was quick, but at that stage of life it just simply was not sporty enough for my taste. My wife and I did several longer trips on it, and really both of us have long legs, and we did not find it comfortable over more than, say, an hour ride. It really began to be uncomfortable beyond that due to the sporting nature of it. It had a decent motor on the low end. Mine may have been running a little bit funny, I'm not sure, but at the top end of the rev range, the power really kind of trailed off. And I noticed on that bike, more than any other bike I ever had, I almost had to keep the throttle pinned when I shifted. Otherwise, if I let off the gas and then got back into the gas in the next gear, it almost took several seconds for it to kind of build the power back in after a shift. Really an odd thing. But I only experienced that at the very top end of the rev range. Otherwise, the bike, ran flawlessly, shifted great. At the time I owned my GPZ1100, I also owned an RF900 Suzuki. And when you would ride the two back to back, the GPZ felt like the hot rod. It definitely had so much more torque and really felt like a big bike. And when you got on the Suzuki, it just gave the impression it felt more like a 750. Now, the Suzuki was much easier handling. It was more compact. And so when I would go riding with, say, my younger brother, I would put him on the RF because it was an easier bike to manage. The GPZ took a lot of steering input and a lot of effort. I had to move around on the bike quite a bit to hustle it in the corners. It would do it. It just, overall, it was just a somewhat high effort bike. It was a little bit tall. It was a little bit heavy. The bars were a little bit close set for the weight of it, and so you didn't have the leverage to, say, throw it around. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the GPZ 1100, any little rise, if I wanted to, I could just blip that throttle and it would bring the front wheel up. The GPZ was quiet. This one had the stock exhaust. In fact, the only thing I did, I took off the purple GPZ stickers on the lower fairing. I didn't like the way they looked. And I also, in order to give it kind of a dual headlight look, I did a cheat and I put a line of electric tape down the middle of the wide single front headlight. And it didn't really block any light, so it still threw nice light, but it looked a little bit more like a VFR or something with dual headlights instead of the single light. Conclusions. I really liked my GPZ 1100. Unfortunately for me, it just did not spark the level of excitement that I wanted out of a sport bike. Conversely, it was not nearly as comfortable as I had anticipated it being two up. The combination of the high weight of the bike, it was almost 600 pounds, and then you had the weight was carried high in the frame. It just made the effort of riding it a little bit much for what I was looking for at the time. I liked the motor. I wish that particular motor had been a little bit more responsive up top. I'm sure if I put a pipe on it and a high performance air filter and some jetting, that I could have gotten a little bit more top end response out of it. But because it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, it wouldn't have solved my handling issues to do that. I would have just been throwing money away at that point. I think a lot of people felt similarly about the GPZ 1100. It was just too much touring flavor for a sport bike and too much sport bike flavor for a touring bike. And it didn't sell well. They had a 3-year production run and they dropped it. And they dropped the GPZ name again. Ultimately, I sold my GPZ 1100 and purchased my next sport bike, Kawasaki's mighty ZX9R. We will cover that in a future episode of Blast from the Past, and I can't wait to talk about that bike. I'd love to know what you guys think. If any of you out there have owned a GPZ 1100 and want to share your thoughts, or you currently own one, please feel free to post that in the comment section below. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.